This is the lesson that was entitled The Revolution Begins. This is when we talked about John the Baptist, and we covered this back in May 15th is what I have written down. So our main texts are Luke 3 and Isaiah 40. We also go to Matthew 3, Mark 1, even 2 Kings 1 through 2. So as we hit some of those references, I'll go ahead and repeat them, but that's where we are. So Luke 3, 1 through 2, John begins to preach sometime in late AD 28 or early 29. We calculate this by the 5 political leaders and the 2 religious leaders that are mentioned in those texts. And then we also read Luke 3, 3 through 4, and Isaiah 40, verse 3. One of the questions we went over is, why do you think that John did not make his announcement in Jerusalem, the religious capital, but instead in a rural area? We had a very interesting discussion about that. For our portrait of John, we read Matthew 3:4, Mark 1:6. We compared it to the portrait we get of Elijah in 2 Kings 1, 2 through 8. Our main takeaways were camel hair shirt, wide leather belt, and 8 insects. So the reason that John has those things in mind with Elijah is to kind of get us in that mindset and to remember Elijah's story and the things that God did through him and kind of make those connections about the prophecies. Okay, and so we talked about, why do you think that the Bible gets specific about what John ate and what he wore? We had a really good conversation about that. Main takeaways about John was he emerged from that same desert that Elijah spent part of his life in. We thought that was really neat. He preached with the same intensity as Elijah. He called people to back to relationship with God like Elijah. He dressed like Elijah. An angel predicted before he was born that John would come in the spirit and power of Elijah. Okay, so we asked, one of the questions we talked about was, what is a good definition of repentance? And we discussed how the Greek word for repentance is metanoia, which means this change of mind or change of attitude. And we talked about, what does that change of mind have to do with repentance or change of attitude? Like, what do those things have in common? There were 3 main groups we discussed. There were 3 main groups who went out into the wilderness to listen to John. So they were soldiers, tax collectors, Pharisees, and Sadducees. We had a discussion about like what would have been their differences and what would have been the things that kind of overlapped and were the same for them, especially when it comes to listening to John. We talked about the motives of the 3 groups and why their motives for listening to John would be different. We talked about the Sadducees and how they ran the temple, and the Pharisees were the experts in the law. We read John's message about Jesus, which we get from Luke 3, 15 through 18. One of the discussions we had was, in a time where everyone's looking for a Messiah, does it make sense that people thought it was John, that he would be the Messiah? Then we read about Jesus's baptism in Matthew 3, 13 through 17. And some of our remaining questions were, if Jesus never sinned, why did he get baptized? What sort of prophet were people looking for? Describe John's message in 1 word. What changes did John want people listening to him to make? Example, he had a different message for the tax collector than his message for the Pharisees. And then, how is Christ's baptism greater than John's? Okay, I want to thank you for watching. I want to remind you, this isn't a substitute for showing up to youth group, but this is to help you kind of be caught up to where we are. Thanks for watching.